June 27, 1977, Duluth, Minnesota, 7 a.m. A nurse named Mildred arrives from her morning shift at one of the most spectacular homes in the state of Minnesota. 39 rooms, 15 fireplaces, 6.9 acres of pristine Lake Superior shoreline. A mansion so grand that when visitors see it for the first time, they stop walking and just stare. Mildred has made this drive dozens of times. She knows the property. She knows the routine. She knows exactly what to expect when she pulls up to the front door. But this morning, something is wrong. The front door is unlocked. She steps inside. The amber light catches the wood-paneled walls the same way it always does. The tapestries hang rich with color. The marble vases line the hallways exactly where they always stand. Everything looks precisely as it would in a house that stood for nearly 70 years, a monument to Minnesota's golden age. But the house feels too quiet. Mildred starts up the grand staircase. Her footsteps echo against the carved wood banister. She reaches the landing where the stairs turn, and then she sees it. The night nurse Velma is lying motionless on the window seat. There's blood on the walls, blood on the floor. It's everywhere. Mildred runs. She runs to the bathroom of the elderly woman who she came to take care of. The room has been ransacked, jewelry scattered across the floor, a nightstand emptied, and in the bed, 83-year-old Elizabeth Congdon lies perfectly still, a satin pillow pressed against her face. Gone. In the hours that follow, investigators will descend onto the mansion. They tape up the crime scene. They photograph every room. And they'll begin a timeline, and almost immediately, they'll know exactly where to look. Now, if you're interested in these kind of cases, unsolved mysteries, missing persons cases by the state, my name's Tony. Welcome to the Cold Case Project. Now, let's get started.
To understand what happened inside Glensheen Mansion on that June morning, you have to go back to the beginning. Because the story doesn't start with the events of 1977. It starts nearly a century earlier, with a man named Chester Congdon and a fortune built on iron. Chester Adgate Congdon was born in 1853 in Rochester, New York, the son of a Methodist minister. His childhood was modest, marked by discipline and loss. When Chester was 15, his father died, leaving him to work in a lumber yard to support his family. He was a young man with nothing except ambition, which, as it turned out, was enough. He worked his way through Syracuse University, earned a law degree, and eventually made his way west to St. Paul, Minnesota, where a partnership with a prominent attorney named William Bilson would put him in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. Because in the late 1800s, northern Minnesota was sitting on one of the largest iron ore deposits ever discovered on the planet, the Mesabi Iron Range, a geological formation stretching across the northern part of the state, packed with iron ore that lay so close to the surface it could be scooped right out of the earth with steam shovels. The men who recognized this early, the men who got in before the rush, became extraordinarily wealthy almost overnight. Chester Congdon was one of those men. He became the Minnesota agent for the Oliver Mining Company, acquiring land and mining rights across the range. He bought stock. He made connections. And when J.P. Morgan consolidated the American steel industry in 1901, buying out Carnegie, Rockefeller, Oliver Mining, and dozens of others to form U.S. Steel, the value of Chester's holdings exploded by more than 500%. He was now one of the wealthiest men in Minnesota, and he decided to build something worthy of that fortune. In 1903, Chester and his wife Clara began looking for land. They found it on a stretch of Lake Superior shoreline just outside Duluth, two small creeks running through wooded ravines down to the water, with views of the lake stretching all the way to the horizon. Chester named it Glensheen. It meant shining glen, a reference to the English village where his ancestors had originated. Construction began in 1905. For 3 years, hundreds of workers transformed that wild lakeshore into something that had never been seen in the upper Midwest. The mansion rose in the Jacobean Revival style, red brick walls trimmed with stone, 15 chimneys reaching toward the sky, twin towers flanking the entrance, 39 rooms spread across 5 floors, 15 fireplaces, custom furniture built to match the woodwork in each space, stained glass windows, a bowling alley, a private pier extending into Lake Superior, the only private pier on the entire lake that appeared on navigational maps used by passing ships. The total cost of construction, $854,000, over $25 million in today's money. But Chester wasn't building to show off, or at least not entirely. He was building a legacy, a home designed to last forever in a place he loved for a family he intended to keep together. He and Clara raised 7 children at Glensheen, the halls filled with the sound of laughter and music and footsteps. Chester read late into the night in his library. Clara hosted dinner parties in a dining room that could seat 40 guests under crystal chandeliers. The house hummed with exactly the kind of life Chester had imagined. And then, in November of 1916, just 8 years after moving in, Chester Congdon died of a pulmonary embolism at age 63. His wife Clara would remain at Glensheen until her death in 1950. After that, the mansion passed to the youngest of Chester and Clara's 7 children, a woman named Elizabeth. Elizabeth Congdon had been born at Glensheen. She had grown up in those 39 rooms, and unlike her siblings, who married and moved away and built their own lives elsewhere, Elizabeth never left. She had come close to marriage once, a long relationship with a man who eventually proposed. She turned him down. She had promised herself to this house and to her mother, and she kept that promise until Clara died. After that, Elizabeth dedicated herself to philanthropy. She served on the boards of universities and charitable organizations throughout the region. She gave generously and quietly, in the way that people who are raised with wealth and also raised with faith tend to do. By most accounts, she was warm, thoughtful, and genuinely kind. In the 1930s, unable to have children of her own, Elizabeth adopted 2 baby girls. The first, adopted in 1932, she renamed Marjorie. The second, adopted in 1935, she named Jennifer. Jennifer grew up quietly. She married, moved to Wisconsin, and lived a respectable, comfortable life. She and Elizabeth were never particularly close, but there was no animosity, no drama. Jennifer simply existed at a comfortable distance from Glensheen and the weight of all that history. Marjorie was something else entirely. From early childhood, Marjorie Congdon displayed behavior that troubled everyone around her. The staff at Glensheen, family friends, teachers, they all noticed something that was difficult to name, but impossible to ignore. She stole from stores, even though she had everything she could possibly want. She set small fires. She was charming in one moment and calculating in the next. She seemed to move through the world by a different set of rules than everyone else. In 1949, when Marjorie was 17 years old, she was evaluated at the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, one of the most respected psychiatric facilities in the country. The diagnosis they gave her was, by the clinical language of the era, sociopath. What we would call today antisocial personality disorder. Elizabeth was told. Elizabeth understood. And then Elizabeth did what mothers who love difficult children have always done. She believed that with enough patience, enough support, enough second chances, her daughter could be different. That belief would cost Elizabeth her life. Marjorie's adult years followed a pattern that, in hindsight, was always going to end somewhere terrible. Her first marriage, to a man named Richard Leroy, lasted 20 years. They lived in Minneapolis. They had several children. Marjorie threw herself into the role of wealthy suburban mother with an intensity that was almost theatrical. Elaborate matching outfits for the kids, horse shows, ice skating competitions, dinner parties, all of it financed by a combination of Richard's income, Marjorie's trust fund, and a steady stream of requests to her mother. Richard was a patient man, but there are limits. By the early 1970s, Marjorie had burned through a $1 million trust fund. $1 million gone. And she kept spending, checks bouncing, bills going unpaid. Elizabeth receiving panicked phone calls asking her to cover this debt and that one, just this once, one more time. Richard finally filed for divorce. He was done. Marjorie moved to Colorado. Fresh start, new city, same Marjorie. In 1975, at a Parents Without Partners meeting, she met a man named Roger Caldwell. Now, Roger Caldwell. Roger was everything Marjorie needed in a partner, and nothing that a reasonable person would describe as a catch. He was a middle-aged salesman who had drifted through life accumulating failures. A helicopter business that collapsed, mounting debts, a reputation among his associates as someone who always had a big plan that never quite materialized. He drove cars he couldn't afford. He dressed well on credit. He was available and he was malleable, and when Marjorie turned that famous charm of hers in his direction, he didn't have a chance. They married in 1976. Within months, they were flat broke, house foreclosed, cars repossessed, using slugs in soda machines because they couldn't scrape together actual change. But Marjorie wasn't worried, because she knew exactly where the money was. By the spring of 1977, Elizabeth Congdon was 83 years old. She had survived a major stroke in 1964 that left her paralyzed on one side and largely unable to speak clearly. She required round-the-clock nursing care. She lived at Glensheen with a rotating staff of nurses and household employees who looked after her. And Marjorie needed money. Desperately. Immediately. In the months before June of 1977, the pattern of Marjorie's desperation becomes visible in the documentary record with disturbing clarity. Roger traveled to Duluth to meet with the Congdon family trustees and asked for $750,000 to purchase a horse ranch in Colorado. He claimed the mountain air would help Marjorie's youngest son's asthma. The trustees said no. He came back and asked for $500,000 to cover their debts and stay out of legal trouble. The trustees said no again. A witness from this period later recalled Marjorie stating directly that she needed the money, and she needed it now, that her mother wasn't going to live forever. On June 22, 1977, 5 days before the events at Glensheen, Marjorie signed and notarized a handwritten document promising Roger $2.5 million of her $8 million share of the inheritance, after her mother died. 3 days later, someone entered Glensheen Mansion. The investigation that followed was, by 1977 standards, remarkably thorough. The night nurse, Velma Piatilla, had been retired for 1 month before the events of June 26th. She had been Elizabeth's day nurse for years. They were genuinely close. And she had come out of retirement that single night as a personal favor, filling in because another nurse had requested the evening off and no replacement could be found. Her husband had begged her not to go. She was 66 years old. The evidence at the scene told investigators a story of what had happened. Someone had entered through a broken window in the lower level. They had moved through the house and encountered Velma on the grand staircase. Velma fought back. She fought hard enough that when her body was found, she still had evidence of the struggle on her hands. She was overwhelmed by the force of a brass candlestick holder. At least 13 blows. Then, whoever was in that house continued to Elizabeth's bedroom. Elizabeth couldn't fight back. The stroke had seen to that. She was helpless in her bed, and the intruder knew it. A satin pillow was pressed over her face and held there. It takes approximately 5 minutes. Then the room was searched, jewelry taken. A distinctive antique Byzantine coin removed from a display case on the dresser. The intruder washed up in a bathroom across the hall, leaving blood in the sink, but, critically, no fingerprints, and left through the front door, taking the night nurse's car keys and driving away in Velma's vehicle. The car was found the next day at the Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport, 150 miles from Duluth. The keys and a parking ticket stamped at 6:35 a.m. were located in a trash can at the airport. Whoever had done this had been in a considerable hurry to get out of Duluth. 3 days after the events at Glensheen, the Congdon family gathered in Duluth for Elizabeth's funeral. Investigators attended. They were looking for something specific. Roger Caldwell arrived with bruises and cuts on his face, swelling in his right hand. When a detective shook Roger's hand in greeting and squeezed, deliberately, with purpose, Roger winced visibly. Marjorie told the family that Roger had been kicked by a horse. Police didn't find that explanation particularly convincing, given that Velma's body told a very specific story about a violent close-quarters confrontation. They began building their case. What followed was a chain of physical evidence that, piece by piece, constructed a picture with only one reasonable conclusion. An envelope arrived at the Caldwell's Colorado address, postmarked from Duluth on the morning of the events. Inside was the Byzantine coin taken from Elizabeth's bedroom. The envelope was addressed in Roger's own handwriting. The antique coin that investigators believed had been taken that night, mailed to himself apparently, a souvenir or a confirmation of completion, or simply the act of a man who was not particularly careful. In Roger and Marjorie's hotel room in Duluth, investigators found pieces of jewelry consistent with items taken from Elizabeth's bedroom. A receipt from the Minneapolis airport gift shop showed Roger had purchased a garment bag there the morning after the events. 2 gift shop employees identified him as the buyer. Hair found at the scene was consistent with Roger's. Blood type matched. And then there was the document. The notarized agreement Marjorie had signed 5 days before, promising Roger $2.5 million of her inheritance, signed 3 days before her mother's passing. Roger Caldwell was arrested. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree homicide. His trial was moved to Brainerd, Minnesota, due to extensive pretrial publicity in Duluth. After 6 weeks of testimony and nearly 3 days of deliberation, the jury found Roger Caldwell guilty on both counts. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. But here's where the story takes a turn that legal scholars still discuss today. Because Marjorie was next. The prosecution charged Marjorie as an accomplice, not as someone who had physically been present at Glensheen that night, but as the architect, the planner, the person whose desperate financial need and whose intimate knowledge of that house made everything possible. The evidence against her was, by any reasonable measure, substantial. The same evidence that had convicted Roger, the same financial motive, the same timeline. The signed document promising Roger a share of the inheritance 3 days before the events occurred. But Marjorie had something Roger didn't: money. She hired Ron Meshbesher, one of the finest defense attorneys in Minnesota, a man with a reputation for taking seemingly impossible cases and finding the one thread that unraveled everything. Meshbesher was aggressive, methodical, and brilliant. He challenged every piece of evidence. He found a fingerprint expert who testified the envelope print wasn't definitively Roger's. He located a witness who claimed to have seen Roger in Colorado the day of the events, a claim that would later be recanted, but not before the jury heard it. And then there was Marjorie herself. She arrived in that courtroom every single day with a knitting project. She sat at the defense table and clicked her needles together with a warm, serene expression on her face, while witnesses described events of almost unimaginable violence. She smiled at jurors during breaks. She chatted pleasantly with reporters. On her attorney's birthday, she baked him a cake and brought it to the courthouse. And when the prosecutor declined a slice, she told him, with a smile, not to worry. She hadn't put any marmalade in it. This was a reference, delivered with apparent amusement, to an incident several years earlier when Elizabeth had become seriously ill after eating homemade marmalade Marjorie had brought to the house. Investigators had suspected the marmalade at the time. They had never been able to prove anything. The jury deliberated for 10 hours. They found Marjorie Congdon Caldwell not guilty on all counts. They liked her so much that when the trial ended and they gathered for a celebration dinner, they invited her. She attended. The legal consequences of Marjorie's acquittal were significant and strange. Roger's attorneys filed an appeal, arguing that different evidence had been presented at Marjorie's trial than at his own. Evidence that, had it been available at his trial, might have produced a different outcome. In 1982, the Minnesota Supreme Court agreed and ordered a new trial. Prosecutors faced a dilemma. Their witnesses were aging. Their evidence had been challenged. An acquittal at a second trial would mean Roger walked away completely free, his conviction erased, nothing left on the record. So they offered a deal. Plead guilty, accept the time already served plus a single additional year. Walk out of prison. Roger said yes. On July 5, 1983, he confessed to entering Glensheen Mansion and taking the lives of both Elizabeth Congdon and Velma Piatilla. He said he had been intoxicated. He said he had no clear plan. He described it as the most disorganized, careless thing he had ever done. He refused, absolutely and completely, to implicate Marjorie, the woman who had visited him in prison exactly once during 5 years of incarceration, the woman who had married someone else while he was behind bars, the woman who had never lifted a finger to help him. Roger Caldwell walked out of prison a free man in the summer of 1983. He returned to Pennsylvania, where he lived on welfare, wore clothes from the Salvation Army, and drank heavily. In 1988, he was found dead in his apartment. A note left behind said he had never taken anyone's life. He had signed a confession 5 years earlier, saying the opposite. Years after his passing, DNA analysis became available. Investigators tested the envelope, the one containing the Byzantine coin, addressed in Roger's handwriting, postmarked from Duluth on the morning of the events. Roger's DNA was confirmed on the envelope. Whatever the truth was about Marjorie's involvement, whether she planned it, whether she knew, whether she simply created the conditions and let Roger fill in the details, Roger Caldwell was there that night. He told the truth about that, at least. Now, if this story ended with Roger's death and Marjorie living quietly in retirement somewhere, it would be a troubling but perhaps comprehensible conclusion. A case where the evidence was circumstantial, the jury made a decision, and everyone moved on. But Marjorie didn't move on. She remarried, a family friend named Wally Hagen, whom she had known for years through their children's competitive ice skating. Wally's wife had been close friends with Marjorie. She developed Alzheimer's and was placed in a care facility. Shortly afterwards, she fell into a coma and passed away. The last person seen with her before she lost consciousness was Marjorie. Marjorie and Wally married not long after. A house they had recently sold in Minneapolis burned to the ground on the night they moved out. Marjorie still had a financial interest in the property through the mortgage. She received the insurance payout. In 1984, she was convicted of arson and insurance fraud. 21 months in prison. She was released. She and Wally moved to Arizona. Houses in their neighborhood began catching fire. Empty properties, garages, structures near the Hagen home. Police initially assumed it was teenagers. Then Marjorie developed a dispute with a neighbor, a man who worked for the Border Patrol, over garbage placement and noise from her dogs. Shortly afterward, the neighbor found an incendiary device on one of his windowsills. Police staked out the property. In the early hours of the morning, someone approached the window and ignited it. The officers chased the figure down. It was Marjorie. She was sentenced to 15 years, but before she had to report to prison, she convinced the court to give her 1 day to arrange care for Wally, who she claimed was seriously ill. His doctors found no evidence of the terminal illness she described. During that 1 day, a passing officer smelled gas coming from the house. He knocked. Marjorie said the stove pilot light had gone out. She sent him away. A few hours later, she called authorities to report that Wally had passed away. The autopsy found a drug overdose. A double departure note was located, describing a plan for both of them to leave together. Wally was gone. Marjorie was very much alive. Charges were considered, then dropped. Marjorie served 11 of her 15 years and was released in 2004. In 2007, she befriended an elderly man at an assisted living facility. She offered to help manage his finances. He signed over power of attorney. He passed away not long afterward. Marjorie used the power of attorney to write checks to herself from his accounts. When police investigated his cause of passing, Marjorie had already arranged to have him cremated before an autopsy could be conducted. She was charged with fraud and forgery. She received probation. As of the time this research was compiled, Marjorie Congdon Caldwell, now in her early 90s, has never been convicted of taking a single life. Not one. Let me tell you what Glensheen looks like today. The University of Minnesota Duluth has operated it as a historic house museum since 1979. More than 100,000 visitors walk through its doors every year. The collection is nearly completely intact. An estimated 98% of the items in the home are original to the Congdon family. Chester's top hat still sits on a chair in his bedroom. Envelopes addressed to Mrs. Congdon still rest near a hallway table. The stained glass filters the same light it filtered when Chester and Clara first moved in. The bedroom where Elizabeth Congdon passed away is preserved exactly as it was in the summer of 1977. The original furnishings remain. The only thing that isn't original is the mattress. The original was taken as evidence and never returned. The grand staircase where Velma Piatilla fought for her life, that carved wooden banister, that landing where the stairs turn, is walked by thousands of tourists every month. Night security staff have reportedly heard footsteps on the stairs when no one is present. Visitors describe cold spots, unexplained sounds, a presence that lingers in certain corners. Whether you believe in that kind of thing or not, there is something undeniably heavy about standing in that house and knowing what happened there. Chester Congdon built Glensheen to stand forever. He built it as a monument to his family and his legacy and everything he believed about what America could be. He could never have imagined what forever would contain.
All right, everybody, that wraps it up. What's your take on today's case? Leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Now, with all that said, like I say in each and every video as you hear the cars passing me by, hit that like, subscribe as I try to get fresh content out to you every day, if not every other day, and share this content. That's how these lesser-known cases gain traction. That's how these lesser-known cases stay in people's attention. The more we can put them out there, the better. All right? Once again, Tony at the Cold Case Project, and I'll see you in the next video.